My prediction, my firm belief with this film is that it's so good, it is going to make the musical theatre fans happy, it's going to make the Wicked fans happy, it's going to make the people who had no idea what this was before happy. Truly, no one mourns. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Joe and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. And can we just take a moment, especially to the theatre fans out there, to acknowledge where we are. Many years we have waited for a film adaptation of one of the most popular musicals of all time, one of the most globally successful musicals of the last few decades. I am talking about Wicked. First seen on Broadway in 2003, seen in the West End from 2006, seen subsequently all over the dang world, there is now finally a feature film adaptation, at least of the first act, because Wicked Part 1 is releasing in cinemas today, this very day, or from this day globally. I know some places in the world still have a little while to wait yet. My thoughts are with you. Don't worry, pretty soon we're all going to be in the same position because we are all going to be waiting for Part 2, which is coming out next year. But having had the chance to go to a screening of the film earlier this week, I am now able to give you all of my thoughts about the film. I've already released a spoiler-free review video that's quite short for me here on my channel, here on my theatre-themed YouTube channel, or on podcast platforms, if that is where you are hearing me. Hello to you. And today I'm going to share with you what I expect will be a considerably longer review where I go into all of the detail and discuss with you the changes from the stage musical to the film, the differences in characterization, in performances, who I thought gave the strongest performances, the visual details, the way that the musical numbers were brought to the screen. So many things for us to talk about today. If you're enjoying today's background setup, by the way, all of the plush and the paraphernalia that you are seeing is from the Noble Collection's new Wicked release, which they very kindly sent to me. And if you're asking yourself why I am not wearing the hat, which is sat on a cushion just over there, in fact, it was manufactured for the head of a child, and I have a famously large head. Anyway, let's waste no further time. There are so many things that we need to discuss about the Wicked movie. Now, by the time that you have seen the Wicked movie, feel free to comment down below with all of your thoughts, spoilers and all. And if you enjoyed this video, and if you are meeting me here for the first time, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel or follow me on podcast platforms. Turn on the notifications so you don't miss any of my upcoming content. I will be sharing more videos about the Wicked movie, talking in more depth about the specific changes from the stage version to the film, maybe highlighting some of the West End performers who are in the film, who knows? If there is Wicked content you would like to see, comment down below and let me know. I'm also planning to do a video where I review all of the many different Wicked promotional collabs and products that they have released, including these from the Noble Collection, so stay tuned for those. And for specific highlights of some of those products, head over to my Instagram and TikTok pages, also at Mickey Joe Theatre. In the meantime, let's talk about the Wicked film. So let me first give you my overview. If you haven't yet watched my spoiler-free review video, I will tell you many of the same things. I really enjoyed this film. I had a great time watching it. It hit all those moments of familiarity with the Wicked musical, and I was like, oh my gosh, it is Wicked. It is Wicked truly brought to a screen, and it gave me all of those goosebump, spine-tingling moments of recognition, but it also feels like its own separate entity. It feels tonally just that little bit different. It has a slightly different character to it, and I think a lot of great choices have been made here by the screenwriters, by director Jon M Chu, in doing enough adaptation that it stands in its own independence. And I've spoken about this many times before, but what works for stage doesn't always work for film, and I think that is the motivation behind many of the changes that I'm going to be outlining in this video. Alongside its relationship to the Wicked stage musical, I also enjoyed its companionship to The Wizard of Oz very much, because this is cinema, it has an obvious kinship to that film, and it really picks right up from where they leave off, because one of the earliest shots that we get is of Elphaba's hat sizzling on the floor in a puddle where she has melted. From there, our perspective flies out of the window following the flying monkeys, and we literally pass over a rainbow. It's an obvious nod to The Wizard of Oz, but it's very sweet. And then we head towards Munchkinland, where Glinda is descending to greet them all. But those aren't the only references to The Wizard of Oz. The title card that they use for Wicked at the beginning and at the end of the film, both significant nostalgic nods to the classic aesthetic of The Wizard of Oz and that era of classic cinema. Also, though I'm getting very ahead of myself, there's a whole recurring thing with poppies that they work into the dialogue between Elphaba and Dr. Dillamond, where they talk about sharing a love of poppies as a flower. So Elphaba brings him poppies in the scene where he gets fired from Shiz and dragged away by his horns. It's slightly traumatic, but this has then laid a foundation of talking about poppies, so the magic that she does here, where in the stage version she just kind of enchants everyone to dance around, as they would, it's a Broadway musical, in the film she now puts them all to sleep by enchanting wanting these poppies to levitate and spin around and put everyone to sleep, which is exactly what the witch does to Dorothy and friends in The Wizard of Oz. It's a throwback. It's a poppy throwback. Shortly after that moment, Elphaba and Fiyero, who was not put to sleep by the poppies because she loves him but she doesn't know it yet, they rescue the lion cub and they take him away. How do they do that? Well, they just run away with him in the stage show. In the film, they get on bicycles that just happen to be there and they put him in the basket, which is also a nod to Miss Gulch in The Wizard of Oz, cycling on her basket. The idea of Miss Gulch stealing Toto to have him destroyed flies very much in the face of Elphaba stealing the lion cub to save his life. It's very interesting. That kind of directly summarizes the idea of what Wicked is versus The Wizard of Oz. It's this glimpse behind the curtain. It's this idea of who she really was. Musically, I believe there is also a reference to that Miss Gulch theme from The Wizard of Oz that we hear at one point while the flying monkeys are flying out of the wizard's tower for the first time. We hear that da-da-da-da-da-da deep in the orchestration. Continuing with my general thoughts, I thought it was sung really well. We will get into specifics. It was a really faithful adaptation of the score of the musical. Very small and very few changes were made. I liked the aesthetics of the thing throughout. I love that it felt like such big fantasy escapism. I loved all of the world building. We can have a conversation about the color grading subsequently. I love how many sets they built. I love that it wasn't, too dependent on CGI. There were only a couple of moments, one of them being Dr. Dillamond, which I thought was pretty well done, and the other being when Elphaba is flying in Defying Gravity, where it feels just that little bit uncanny valley, that little bit like where you can tell that it's CGI. The length, I agree, it does feel like a long film, and I think it is that little bit longer than it needs to be, but people have been waiting a really long time for this, so some people are of the opinion like, make it as long as you want. We want as much Wicked movie as possible. I think it could have been trimmed that little bit. There are a handful of scenes that just begin to drag, but I don't agree that they could have done the entire thing in one film, and they certainly, if they had, they wouldn't have retained the same richness of themes that they have found in this one, which I will talk more about. I enjoyed all of the performances. We didn't get that thing we have had in previous movie musicals where one or two people are distractingly bad. I thought everyone did a pretty great job, especially those doing the heavy lifting, especially Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo as Glinda and Elphaba, and I was so fascinated by the extent to which some of these characters have shifted or just modulated slightly. That being in response to this being on screen rather than on stage, or to certain changes made within the plot. But it was magical, it was fantastical, it felt naturally musical. At no point was there any sense of unease or reluctance about them bursting into song. I do think not quite enough was done to make this feel like a self-contained film. It very much feels like a first act because we don't really address the continuity of the framing device. Like, we never really conclude that whole sequence with Glinda in Munchkinland, and the way that the film actually begins with us hearing a few of those lines, with us hearing the Munchkins asking Glinda if it's true they were really friends. And true enough, we see that friendship, but because we don't in this film get back to that moment in Munchkinland, it all feels very unresolved, which it is, because it's a part one. Anyway, those are my general thoughts, and for anyone who finds my reviews too lengthy, consider that the entire thing. For those of you who want to hear all of the juicy details, let's keep going. Now, I want to talk about the plot of this specific film version here, and I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the plot of Wicked, because I gather most people are familiar with it, but it's been brought to my attention there are some people just discovering Wicked now for the first time. There were some people in my advanced screening who had never seen Wicked before and weren't familiar with it, which I think should have been illegal, but anyway. Wicked the musical is an early 2000s Broadway musical based on the novel of the same name by Gregory Maguire, that explores the idea of the Wicked Witch of the West from L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, having had this backstory that justifies her perceived wickedness, or in fact her actual wickedness. Now, there is quite a difference between the tone and some of the content of Gregory Maguire's novel and the stage version, which is a lot more family friendly. In this version of Wicked, we find out that Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, and Glinda the Good were childhood friends, or they were friends at university where they met at Shiz, though not initially. Initially, they ended up having to unexpectedly share a room together at the university, and they very quickly grew to despise each other. However, circumstances brought them together. We find out that Elphaba, because of the way that she has been treated all of her life, because of her green exterior, because of her green skin, both by her peers, by those around her, and her own parents, her own father, feels very strongly about the bad things that are happening to the animals in the land of Oz, a land where certain animals are able to speak. And she is very disturbed as she witnesses the ostracization of these animals in her own university, as her beloved friend and Professor Dr. Dillamond, who is a goat of a man, is fired and dragged away by officials, and they then see a lion cub kept in a cage who will never learn to speak. Elphaba ends up freeing the lion cub along with a student named Fiyero, who is technically dating Glinda but finds himself in a love triangle situation with both of the witches. Listen, we've all been there. And when she has the opportunity to go and meet with the wonderful Wizard of Oz, she appeals to him to help do something about what's happening to all of the animals, only she finds out that he is actually at the center of this because he has traveled to Oz from America, from the human realm. He doesn't make that clear to her, but what he says is that where he comes from, the best way to bring people together is to give them a common enemy, and so he is using the animals as a scapegoat. In league with the witch's own teacher, Madame Morrible, who is in on this whole conspiracy. Elphaba is outraged by this and flies out of the ceiling. That's basically what happens in the first act of Wicked, and that is the plot of part 1 of the Wicked movie. It literally takes the first act and puts it on screen. Except there are several differences in the plot. Small differences, but they make a big impact. Perhaps one of the largest is that when Elphaba and Glinda and Elphaba's younger sister Nessarose and Boq a Munchkin all arrive at Shiz, Elphaba is not initially planning to attend. She is not enrolled. She is only there to help her father, who is the governor of Munchkinland, drop off his preferred daughter Nessarose, who is a wheelchair user. This being because of complications during her birth, for which Elphaba feels responsible because her father made her mother chew milk flowers or something so the baby wouldn't come out green. The way that Elphaba ends up attending Shiz after all is while trying to protect Nessarose, she ends up doing some magic because her emotions are running high. This is something we see more of in the film as we see moments from their childhood. Elphaba getting bullied by local Munchkin children and telekinesising some rocks over at them. We learn about this connection between her heightened emotional state and the magic that she isn't necessarily able to particularly control. It's very X-Men that way. Now, when Elphaba's magic causes a certain amount of chaos and destruction at Shiz, Madame Morrible sees this and takes credit for it. Madame Morrible, who I should point out, is not the head shistress of Shiz University, as she is in the stage musical, but is just relegated to being in charge of sorcery, which I find hilarious, because she says to Glinda, who appeals to her about wanting to take her sorcery tutorial, that she doesn't teach this every semester. And if in this version of the show that's now her only responsibility is teaching sorcery, and she doesn't teach this every semester, that is the cushiest academic gig that anyone has ever had, where she's like, I always work here, I'm presumably consistently housed and paid at this boarding school university, but the one thing that I am paid to do, I don't necessarily do every semester. I only do it if someone magical comes along, which possibly has never happened until Elphaba's arrival. Anyway, Morrible takes credit for the magic, although Glinda knows better, and Morrible goes to Elphaba and tells her that she must enroll and she must take her sorcery tutorial and she will teach her and take no other students because she is very special. Elphaba and Glinda subsequently are not immediately enemies. They have this slightly awkward introduction where Glinda, seeing that Elphaba is green, tries to do this performative activism thing and suggests that once she becomes magical, which she believes is inevitable and guaranteed, she will help cure Elphaba of this ailment, which Elphaba basically finds racist or greenist at the very least. Only it isn't really until after they're forced to share the same dormitory and Elphaba sort of refuses to ask Madame Morrible to tutor Glinda also that they really begin to despise each other. The loathing may be unadulterated, but it is not instantaneous. A couple of other changes we encounter, some of them with Nessarose and her father, the governor. The silver shoes that he gifts her upon arrival to Shiz, we have seen previously. They are from her mother. That, just like the poppies, is slightly more sophisticated writing than in the stage version because, objects just being introduced and talked about before they become relevant. Another example being mentions of the Grimmery before we encounter it in the wizard's, office, throne room, the place where he keeps the big head. Chamber? I'm going to go with chamber. In fact, when Elphaba and Glinda have arrived in the Emerald City in order to meet with the wizard and are basking in all of the joy of that green metropolis, they go to attend Wizardmania, which is something that happens in the stage musical also, which is just a little show about the wizard coming and saving everyone. They go into slightly more detail of the backstory of all of this in the film version, and Wizardmania is this outdoor open-air promenade performance, which theatrically I have an awful lot of time for. And they talk specifically about the ancient ones of Oz and how they stored all of their magic in the Grimoire, but then they all died out and no one could read it until the arrival of the wizard, who convinced the people of the Emerald City that he could read it. Elphaba will later learn, after reading and performing spells from the Grimoire herself, that he in fact can't, and that's why he needs her. It's in that same interaction that he, showing a little model village version of Oz to Elphaba and Glinda, introduces the idea of connecting all of these different parts of the realm via one road that leads everyone to the wizard, cementing himself at, you know, the intersection of their culture and making himself very important, almost deifying himself, really. And I love this because the Wicked stage musical suggests the foundations of many key moments of Wizard of Oz lore, like how did the Tin Man get turned into tin? Where did the Scarecrow come from? Why is the lion cowardly in the first place? And the ruby slippers, all of these things. But as far as I can remember, in the stage version at least, they never really talk about the building of the Yellow Brick Road, and that's what this moment is. Going back to Nessa and her father, right towards the end of the film, big spoiler here, Wicked Part 1, we see this moment where Morrible's words after Elphaba's escape, she can't be trusted, she's a wicked witch, all of that stuff is broadcast around the nation, and we see Nessarose and her father reacting to that. He falls down having a heart attack, and it's implied that this is his death. In the musical, we learn about this in the second act, but we don't see it. This is yet another difficult thing happening in Nessarose's life, because in the film we see her perceiving slightly more directly that even though she is dating Bock in a way that has been set up by Glinda, she notices that he is still pining after her. I don't know if we see this as much in the stage version. It's sort of up to an actor's own interpretation in the stage version whether or not Nessa ever knew about Bock's feelings for Glinda. Finally, Fiyero's entrance is quite different in the film. Elphaba stumbles upon him in the middle of the night. He nearly runs her down on horseback. And this introduction characterizes him in a very different way, but I'll talk about this when we talk about the characters later on. There's also an animal band at the Ozdas Ballroom, which I am given to believe is a reference to the Gregory Maguire novel. In fact, many of these choices may be. But this, I feel, kind of leads us into a conversation about the themes of the Wicked movie that have been brought out by director Jon M Chu, especially where they differ slightly or go into more depth than the stage musical, so let's talk about those. Now, Nessarose's story, I feel, is being told quite differently already in the film. For one thing, they have cast an actress, Marissa Bode, who is a wheelchair user. This is not something that happens on the stage. And further to that casting authenticity, in the first scenes where we meet Nessarose, there's a lot more agency afforded to her as a character, and in fact the motivation behind Elphaba becoming upset and doing all of the magic that breaks a load of stuff in Shiz is Miss Coddle, who is a character who has become the head Shizdress of Shiz University, pushing Nessa towards her dorm location, just generally suggesting that she will do things for her and kind of infantilizing her and patronizing her as a wheelchair user. This is stuff we didn't even touch on in the stage musical. And so it's great that Nessarose already immediately has a little more depth to her character, and this is the idea of her wanting to become independent. And sort of the first strike for her with Elphaba is Elphaba almost upstaging this moment of Nessa's independence, because this was going to be her school that she was going to, and Elphaba not only makes a spectacle of the situation inadvertently while trying to protect her, but ends up going to the school and kind of making it about her. This is not the only area where Jon M Chu finds parity between this fantastical story and real-world themes in society, because Elphaba too represents very real ideas of racism and feeling othered and feeling discriminated against because of the colour of her skin. This is an obvious parallel. And it always has been, and Winnie Holtzman, the book writer of the stage musical who also worked on the film, played a lot on that idea as well, but we explore it in more depth here. And the key difference, I think, is that Elphaba in the stage musical arrives with a certain amount of anger and frustration and feels slightly more confident in and of herself, whereas Elphaba in the film is already more resigned to the reality of her circumstance. She's not angry because it doesn't surprise her when she is treated this way in her arrival at Shiz. It's reflected in the dialogue that's always been there as well, when she says, let's get this over with, no, I'm not seasick, yes, I was born green, no, I didn't eat grass as a child. When she says, let's get this over with, she's had to do that so many times. Those are the things that she's always been taunted with. And so instead of arriving with a certain amount of confidence in her own convictions, but frustration at the rest of the world, Elphaba in the film arrives with a large amount of shame. She is not fighting against her father's mistreatment of her. She knows that that's futile. And the film becomes about her finding her own confidence, her own voice, and learning to overcome the internalized shame that society has forced on her. In fact, there's a beautiful moment that's been added towards the end of the thing where the wizard offers to degreenify her, as she has dreamed about in the song The Wizard and I, but her position on it has changed from that I Want song to the end of the film because Glinda, as a friend, and Fiyero as well, have both helped her find enough love for herself. They've helped her find the self-love that she can say, no, that's not what I want anymore. I want you to help the animals. This being another theme that is really brought out in the film version. We really explore all of this animal oppression, and a few things are done differently in order to really highlight that. The first is that Elphaba is explicitly raised by an animal, by her nanny Dulcie Bear, who is a bear. And though I think there's a little more subtlety in Elphaba relating to the animal struggles because she has also felt othered and ostracized by society because of the whole green thing, it's obvious to see where it comes from now that she has been, that like the closest thing she has known to a loving parent was a bear. Now we also see many more animals in the film version than we did on stage. In fact, Dr. Dillman is no longer the only animal on the faculty, and Elphaba follows him late one evening after he has told her about bad things that he has perceived happening in Oz to this fearful late night meeting of himself and other animals who are deciding amongst themselves whether it's safe for them to stay or whether they need to flee Oz. It's very familiar of marginalized groups in countries on the brink of war and on the brink of devastating reality. What I will say is a little confusing here is what seems to be a slightly permissive attitude of Elphaba towards certain animals in servitude, like we're just not really consistent with what indicates animal enslavement and what doesn't. When they go to the Emerald City, they're having their nails attended to by hummingbirds who are working in the salon, and like fair enough for these animals to have jobs and be working professionals, but if the wizard really is sort of shutting down what he calls seditious animal activity, wouldn't that have started at the Emerald City, in which case these animals would be fine to be there as long as they're not speaking, and wouldn't that bother Elphaba? Unless, of course, she doesn't notice that they're not speaking, because she does have this moment with Chistery where she sort of begins to clock the fact that he can't speak and she begins to get concerned. She doesn't immediately get enraged by seeing all of the monkeys as guards in the entrance to the wizard's throne room. This is a very different thing from the stage musical where she only learns about one monkey who the wizard portrays as his charming manservant, and it's only afterwards she finds out about more of them and that the plan is for them to be militarized, and this is the big surprise. The movie has to do a little bit of legwork to try and justify her outrage, having already seen all of the monkeys with the spears. There's also Fiero's horse that he rides in on, and the horse can speak but is happy for Fiero to ride him. I mean, Fiyero is Jonathan Bailey, so listen, who amongst us? But I don't know, it feels that littlest bit inconsistent. And I should mention, because I know someone's going to put it in the comments, in the book of Wicked there are animals with a capital A and there are animals with a little a, and the animals with a capital A, they're the ones who are slightly anthropomorphic and can speak, and they're the ones who deserve rights, and the ones with a little a don't. Carrying on then, I usually save this section for the end, but let's talk about the performances. And let's talk about Elphaba first of all. Excuse me, where's my hat? I have my hat and a broom. This is amazing. Dreams are being realized today. Can't even cover my eyes if I tried to. So like we've already said, Elphaba in the film feels that little bit less confident at the beginning than she does in the stage musical. It's more about her overcoming that internalized shame, right? Cynthia Erivo's performance is so mindful of that. It is such a thoughtful, nuanced take on this character. And it means that when she does find these moments of emotion, when she does find this rage, both at seeing the way that her sister might be mistreated and feeling protective of her, and then feeling the same way towards the animals, and feeling this really guttural, devastated indignation towards the wizard when she is trembling and there's tears in her eyes, and she looks horrified as she's pointing up to him and she's saying, it's you're the one who's been doing this, you have no real power. That is such a powerful moment. I think generally Cynthia does her best work as Elphaba in the final 30 minutes. From this meeting with the wizard onwards, that moment when she says, no, I'll stay green. You don't need to use magic to change the colour of my skin. Unbeknownst to her, there's nothing he can do about it, beyond offering her a great coverage foundation because the man's not magic. But that is such a moment for her character arc, beautifully played. And I do think it's a really smart choice for her Elphaba to have been tinged with that little bit of sadness at the beginning, and for her to learn to find that confidence in and of herself. It also justifies her inability to control and command her own magical ability at the start of the story, because that is another thing that she has been made to feel ashamed of. And because of her upbringing, she is not this willful, outspoken, confident girl. She is very quiet, and she is quite sullen. Now, I'm not sure how everyone will feel about this, because a couple of moments are played very small. Ariana and Cynthia both do this, where it's not murmuring, but it's considerably more soft-spoken than we are used to those characters being in a stage version. Because again, this is film and this is not the stage. And that makes sense, it just takes a little bit of getting used to. Let's talk about the vocals, because Cynthia Erivo obviously is going to give you a fantastic vocal performance. She's one of the finest vocalists that we have. And she sounds fantastic. I love that she finds difference between The Wizard and I and Defying Gravity. There is a joy to the first one, but there is a true emboldening and release to the latter, to that Defying Gravity moment when she is growling and war crying from the skies. I like the vocal choices she makes because it makes the music feel fresh and new. She doesn't feel like a replacement Elphaba, which for the film version is not something I want to experience. Also, it's worth saying the version of Wicked that everyone thinks is the default is based on choices that Adina made and modifications she made to the score in the first instance that were not necessarily written that way. Not forgetting also the work that Stephanie J. Block did in helping to develop the character in readings that took place prior to the Broadway production. And so for Cynthia to just sing the score as written and do every single thing as written would not be her interpretation of it, and I love her interpretation of it. It makes it new, it makes it fresh, it makes it exciting, and it makes it feel authentic. I've seen many Elphabas with considerable vocal prowess who don't necessarily feel like they are saying those words and thinking those words for the first time, and that's something that Cynthia does here. She's such an actress. The one thing I have not even misgivings about, but I am just cautiously anticipating, is what she's going to do in the second film. Because her Elphaba is so justified and so considered, and she doesn't have that slightly like quality that some of the others do on stage that foreshadows the wicked witch that she will become, familiar of The Wizard of Oz, foreshadowing all of the my pretty and your little dog too, all of that stuff. Elphaba has to eventually get there because, spoiler alert, Wicked is not saying, oh, she was never evil. Wicked is saying, she did all of that wicked stuff, but this is why she did it. And for this first film to be a journey for Elphaba to find confidence and strength in herself, I'm really curious as to how she's going to get her to that place of resentment and anger and rage and almost malice. Now let's talk about Ariana Grande's performance as Glinda. Gotta keep my head very still to balance this crown. Boop! Now, before I even begin to discuss her performance in the film, what I want to acknowledge here is people were quite critical of Ariana's casting, despite the fact that she had a theatrical background some years ago. She was in 13 on Broadway. What I also want to point out is that, based on everything we've heard, she is really the ambassador for fandom of Wicked the Musical, and was on that set. She was the one saying to Jon M Chu, you can't cut that line, it's Bible. My theory about that is it may have been the line pink goes good with green, where they've now added Elphaba correcting her and saying goes well with green, and Glinda kind of being unfazed by this. That moment aside, what I find so interesting is Glinda is not dumb in this film. She is a little bit vacuous at times. She's a little bit thoughtless, perhaps, and inconsiderate, but that feels more rooted in the privilege with which she was obviously raised, and she still comes out with some silly and ridiculous things, but she never feels stupid. She feels equally from the off like a very ambitious young woman who is already immediately very concerned with making sure she is perceived to be wonderful and generous and kind by everyone around her. In the musical, this kind of comes to her naturally, and we don't really see her putting in the work to curate her reputation, but in the film, when we see her see Elphaba being green for the first time, she immediately goes to work and making sure that everyone around can hear her offering to degreenify Elphaba when she inevitably becomes magical and powerful. This also goes back to what I was saying before about Glinda not being spiteful to Elphaba to begin with. It's not until Elphaba suggests to her that she's not going to help her with Madame Morrible that Glinda really begins to resent Elphaba. So that feels more earned, but crucially, they are both allowed to feel like real people. And I actually think not only does Ariana almost have as much to do in this film as Cynthia does, but they really share the narrative thrust. It is truly a story about both of them in this part 1. It's not that Ariana gets part 1 and Cynthia gets part 2. They really, it's about both of them thus far. And so I do feel a little bit dubious about Ariana being considered a supporting actress in this, but if it makes it more likely for her to win a Golden Globe, then sure. And honestly, she might, because she does fantastic work in this film. She is hilarious in this. I think a lot of naysayers are going to come out of this film saying Ariana Grande really killed this. And vocally, she is not giving you a stage vocal. She sounds not unlike Kristen Chenoweth. That is probably the Glinda with whom she has the most vocal parity. She doesn't have quite the same strength to her soprano register, and it still sounds poppy as much in the editing as in her performance, honestly. But I also think Cynthia has a very pop-ready sound. We'll talk more about that when I talk about the music in just a moment. But it's Ariana's comedy that really wins the day here. She is so funny in so many moments. She has a line when they're helping to decide the colour that the brick road ought to be, and she gets Elphaba to cycle back to yellow, and she says, it just feels like road to me, or it just says road to me. I was laughing hysterically. That was the moment I'm literally on-off laughing again, just thinking about it for about 30 seconds afterwards. It was so funny. And she has a bunch of moments like that. And what I find really surprising is that her being as big a Wicked fan as she is, she makes those line readings feel fresh. There is a rhythm to those jokes that a lot of people repeat and land the same way, because that's the way that it works, and that's the way it's directed on stage, and that's just the sound of that comedy. And she finds ways to make it sound not only new but still funny, and funny in different ways. Now here's something interesting. Glinda at the very beginning, arriving to the Munchkins, wearing this, holding this, giving it "No One Mourns the Wicked," telling them, "Good news everyone, the Wicked Witch of the West is dead," hearing them sing lyrics that directly fly in the face of things that she has recently done, when they're singing "No one mourns the wicked, no one cries, they won't return, no one lays a lily on their grave." At this point in her lifetime, she has recently done all three of those things. And so actresses playing Glinda have a choice to make in this moment about how good of an actress they think Glinda is and how much they want to portray, because for many audiences, they still don't necessarily know everything that is going to happen. So you don't want to give too much away, but returning fans of Wicked will be looking for that moment of recognition. And Ariana's Glinda gets through so much of this opening spiel with nothing but a smile on her face, with no sense of sadness behind the eyes. The only moment is when the Munchkins wheel out this big effigy of the Wicked Witch, which they're going to set fire to, and Glinda is handed the torch, and she gets to be the one to throw the torch and do this action and do this gesture. And there is the littlest moment of reservation before she does, this slight flash of pain. And then we only see that again when she is asked, when she's about to leave, by a Munchkin, "Is it true you knew her? Is it true you were her friend?" And we see her explanation of this and her recollection of this truth juxtaposed with shots of the two of them having been friends at Shiz together. It's very subtly played, it's very tenderly played, and it makes me very excited for what she is going to do with Glinda's arc in the second act, which I think is some of the most interesting moments for that character. She also has a slightly different toss for the film, which I fear will soon become iconic. It's very good. Now I've started talking about their vocal performances, let's talk about the music in this film. And the biggest question always with movie musicals is, how do we do the songs? Are they dream sequences? Are they really happening? And with Wicked, it doesn't really matter because The Wizard of Oz has already happened. And I think with this kind of a fantastical realm, it's less jarring to see people on screen bursting into song. It's like no one's really questioning why she's singing her in a monologue because she's already green. What I do find the littlest bit jarring is the discrepancy between the chorus vocals and the individual, because Ariana and Cynthia, in their own ways, each sound very radio ready. They sound very sort of pop contemporary. It's still a full, expressive, theatrical vocal. It's just not quite as big as it would be for the stage. And Cynthia still has the range and the power, but even just the way it's been edited, it sounds that little bit more current, that little bit more trendy. The Wizard and I less so, but I'm Not That Girl almost sounds like a credits song, you know, that kind of like an R&B credits moment. Popular is another one that sounds not unlike a pop song, and I don't mind them by themselves. It's just because all of the orchestrations and all of the wider chorus vocals all sound so familiar of the cast recording and of the stage version. And Stephen Schwartz worked on this, and Stephen Arimas worked on this, so that is not surprising. And that's also a great thing as well, when we're hearing the full overture as we're getting these establishing shots going from the Kiamako castle to Munchkinland, that is wonderful and brilliant, and I love that they retain the entire thing. Like I said before, very few changes are made to the score. There is a moment at the end of Popular where she modulates up on these Lars, giving it just a slightly more triumphant finish. At the screening I was at, there was applause for Popular and there was applause for The Wizard and I, and then again for Defying Gravity. We do need to discuss Defying Gravity a little bit here. I like the vocal performance of it a lot. I love her new interpretation of the battle cry at the end. I know it's not ah, but technically you do hear that elsewhere in the film. I will explain where momentarily, but I like that Cynthia has a raw new version of it that sounds like a battle cry and doesn't sound like this rehearsed, like I'm hitting these notes. Instead it's like just exploding out of her and it feels natural. It feels like something Elphaba would actually scream as she's flying in the sky and waging war on society. But the sequence for Defying Gravity and the way that that scene has been edited, I dare say, makes it a little hard to enjoy the song because it's so divided. We keep cutting away to different things in between these different moments of the song. And the stage version does that as well, but the stage version does it just enough and it happens a little too often in the film for my liking. However, the cut before the final section where she is initially falling out of this tower and she doesn't know how to fly and she finds the strength to because she sees a reflection of her younger self, that is one of the most emotive moments of the film. So it's worth it for me just for that. While we're talking about editing choices, this is another of the small criticisms that I have, is there are a couple of moments where the editing just feels that little bit strange. There is a shot where Jeff Goldblum goes from standing to suddenly sitting with Elphaba and Glinda as he begins singing Sentimental Man. That is a little bit odd. And I got a little fatigued by Elphaba and Glinda on the train station platform when they start at one end and then Glinda goes up to go retrieve people and then comes back to that other end and then they both go back to the other end to go and get on the train and then the train comes back to that lower end and then Glinda gets on at that there's just too much walking up and down the train platform. If I'm a commuter trying to get on that train, I'm getting very annoyed at these two girls running up and down the platform the entire time. Just like, have your conversation and pick a door. In general, Jon M Chu seems to, in his musical numbers, really eschew the idea of minimalism. I'm Not That Girl is probably the stillest, but in many of them we are moving around and the camera is flying upside down and we're seeing things in reflections, and Elphaba in The Wizard and I is running through a cornfield, very familiar of Kansas from The Wizard of Oz, by the way. The busiest is What Is This Feeling, aka Loathing. We actually start in a split screen between Elphaba and Glinda. It's very music video that way. There's a moment that looks a little bit ABBA almost at the beginning when we see their faces alternately face on and then in profile. The first half of that song gets a little bit tiring because they just keep passive-aggressively moving luggage from one side of the room to the other. Like, we just see that one too many times, I feel, and it's also like, you've been there for enough, just unpack at this point. Why are there still so many boxes? Erin, my fiance, also pointed out that we see them doing combat training for some reason. Shiz is clearly a military school, but we see them fighting at one point that foreshadows something that happens in Act 2 of the stage version when they are fighting with wand and broom. And we do get a moment of group choreography when all of the other students are singing "Dear Glinda, you are just too good," which I think has deliberately been added for some kind of a TikTok viral moment, not unlike the Red Beret girl doing this in Revolting Children in Matilda. It's already having that effect on TikTok, even if it wasn't intentional, so good job to them. Finally, let's discuss some of the other performances, and let's begin with Jonathan Bailey as Fiyero. Now, like I said, his entrance is very different here, and that characterizes him from the beginning in a very different way, because he's not being pulled up kind of half asleep in the back of a carriage like some obnoxious wealthy prince. He still is a wealthy prince, and arguably he's still obnoxious, but we meet him in the middle of the night riding a horse. And throughout his early scenes, he actually seems a lot more pensive and a lot more thoughtful. There's a line Elphaba has always had where she says to him, "You're not as shallow as you make people think you are, otherwise you wouldn't be so unhappy." And that kind of comes out of nowhere in the stage version, but in the film, we really see that behind his eyes in those first few moments, and we can see that he is contemplative and reflective, and he knows a little more than he's letting on, and that the whole idea of dancing through life and this shallowness and this empty-headedness is actually a pretense. And he still has this brooding charm, he's still flirtatious, he has big bisexual energy as it happens. Something I can't quite get past is he speaks with a British accent. Cynthia, who is British, has an American accent as Elphaba. Fine, because I think it works for Fiyero that he has this charming, like, what's the most swankified place in town? And like saying to Elphaba, you really don't have to do that, you know. I don't know why they then, having made that choice, make him sing with American vowels. In Dancing Through Life, he's singing Dancing Through Life rather than Dancing Through Life. And we have had more than enough Fiyeros in the West End singing it with British vowels, singing dancing rather than dancing. And maybe it would have grated to the ear, especially when people who haven't seen it anywhere other than the US would be used to hearing Dancing Through Life. It's just confusing to me, just slightly perplexing, because I think it loses him a little of the princely charm that he has when he's doing a British accent, when he's giving you Anthony Bridgerton. What I will say though is this is barely a concern, because the way that he delivers this number, you could honestly watch it with no volume whatsoever and you still have a wonderful time. This is another one. I am deeply curious, especially in the way that Fiyero has been set up with more thoughtfulness, to see how this character continues to grow in the second film, where so much happens to him. In fact, at the end of the first film, we see him reacting to this proclamation about Elphaba and setting out on a horse as if to go and find her immediately. I was like, wow. Speaking of that proclamation, let's talk about Michelle Yeoh as Madame Morrible. Now, I mentioned already, her character from the stage version has been sort of split into two, because she is no longer head of sorcery and head shizstress at Shiz University. Instead, Miss Coddle, played by Keala Settle, with an accent I can't quite place. It's either Australian or it's British. Like, it's kind of somewhere between the two. Honestly, she is now head shizstress, and from what we can tell of her character, she's a little bit of a pushover, and she doesn't really listen. But even from the way she enters and the way that she addresses Miss Coddle, it is clear that Madame Morrible is the one who really calls the shots around here. I love the design they've done for her wig and for her costume specifically. I haven't really talked about this. All of the hair and the makeup and the costumes on this film, stunning, gorgeous, extraordinary. The set design as well, everything they've done with Shiz. I appreciate that they probably felt they had to distance it from the other magical castle that we've seen a lot on film. I think they did a great job in doing something different with it that feels sort of very European with the watery entrance. Anyway, back to Michelle. Because they've taken away that bubbly, I am Madame Morrible, your head shizstress part of her personality, she is a lot more serious. She's a lot more mysterious and stern in a way. It's not a huge stretch for her to turn into the villain that we know her to be by the end of the first part, and specifically in the second. But what's interesting here is she kind of feels like a Morrible who needs Glinda once Elphaba has flown away. And thinking back to the stage show, she doesn't as much, because Morrible in the stage show is very warm, is very bubbly when she wants to pretend that she is and is good at public speaking. And in this film, Michelle's Morrible is not quite that, and she needs the more palatable, charming Glinda in order to be the public face of all of this. And that feels like the reason why when Elphaba flies off into the sky, Morrible heads up onto this balcony area and orders the guards to let Glinda go and goes over to her. It's the moment signaling like, I am going to embrace you, you are going to stay with us, and we are going to mold you into this thing that you have always wanted to be, but we are going to use you to further our agenda, because this Morrible can't do that by herself. She needs Glinda. That I find so interesting. Now, she is joined, of course, in this wicked scheme by Jeff Goldblum as the Wizard. And he does a decent enough job here. And if this were to be the only time I'd ever seen Jeff Goldblum on film, I'd be like, sure, he's a good enough wizard. At no point in this film did I stop thinking that is Jeff Goldblum, because he does a similar kind of a shtick that he has done on many things before, and people find it very funny. It just has that quality where every line feels improvised, and it feels as though he is searching for the end of the sentence. There's one particular line where he pauses and says, Munchkinland. And the delivery of it doesn't even feel like he thinks Munchkinland is a real place. It's like he's Jeff Goldblum joking about Wizard of Oz things, rather than really delivering it with conviction. I also didn't get much, and he's never been as overtly malicious as Morrible, but I didn't get as much in the shift from the charm with which he greets Elphaba and Glinda to what then happens subsequently when his whole sham facade is made clear to Elphaba. What I did find quite amusing is that he really seems styled after Walt Disney when he takes them to one side and he shows them the R's of tomorrow. He feels very sort of classic of that era, but also like the father to us all, and the man who had a dream, and the man who kept it like, I don't know, it felt like Universal saying, you know who the real villain is? Walt Disney. And that I thought was quite funny. I also want to shout out Karis Musengol, who plays young Elphaba. She does a fantastic job, as does Cecily Collette-Taylor, who plays young Nessarose, and Andy Nyman, who brings real emotional depth to Governor Throp, to Elphaba's father, and the way that he interacts with Nessarose with this real palpable fear about anything happening to her, when he treats her with such fragility and and pained love. And he finds humanity in this disdain of Elphaba because it's a resentment that he has grown to live with as well. So he's still... he is short-tempered with her, but he is not just a pantomime villain towards her at all time, but because that's not sustainable over that many years of her life. That's not realistic. He finds a way to make this three-dimensional and nuanced and layered. Finally, and this is the very last thing I'm going to be talking about, I know I said this is a spoiler review, but this is a real spoiler. If you don't want to know about cameos in the film, look away now. But we get 3 delicious cameo moments from the show's composer, Stephen Schwartz, as well as its original stars, Idina Menzel and Kristin Chenoweth. In that moment I told you about before, in Wizardmania, Idina and Kristin are performing as performers in that, which makes sense. We see them on stage being actresses and sort of having this slight rivalry between each other. Chenoweth gets to do a high soprano note. Idina gets to do the iconic Defying Gravity riff. I was so overwhelmed by how exciting that was that I couldn't really work out where that riff came from in the song, and it felt a little bit forced, but I'm going to go back and watch the film again and maybe I'll feel differently about that. I also love that because Elphaba was the one who was really magic and Glinda always struggled with her magic, at least in what we see in Wicked, that there's a moment where Chenoweth can't get her wand to switch on the same way Idina's has, so she's knocking it against hers to get it to work. And then they go through the streets and they have a moment with Cynthia and Ariana, kind of like a literal passing of the torch, and that's beautiful. It's also funny because Chenoweth shushes Ariana as Glinda at one point. Very, very funny. And finally, Stephen Schwartz gets the iconic line, "The wizard will see you now," and kind of does that thing I've always joked about, where wouldn't it be funny if the performer doing that line delayed it for a really long time to build the suspense? That's kind of what happens here, is we get this sense of anticipation, and it's one of the most iconic lines for an ensemble member in the show, and so glad that Stephen Schwartz got to do it. That's a really joyous moment. The whole One Short Day sequence is one of my favourite moments in the film, and everything that happens beyond that I think is fantastic. That is everything I think I have to say at this time about the Wicked movie. Honestly, there is more to say about this film, but I thought it was great. I thought it has its own character and it's made necessary choices to individualize itself and to work on screen and to ground its characters in more depth and more reality, and that is something that I appreciate. It's even made me look back at the Wicked musical and go, oh yeah, this makes more sense than that ever did. Anyway, I have been speaking for far too long and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. What did you think of the Wicked movie? How excited are we for part 2? My answer is very. I will of course see you this time next year with my full review of the Wicked movie part 2, but between now and then there will be so many videos, not just about the Wicked movie, but about many other things on stage around the world as well. So if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, turn on those notifications, go find me across the rest of the internet. I'm on Instagram, I am on TikTok, I am on Blue Sky, and you can also find all of my reviews and interviews on podcast platforms. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this review of the Wicked movie, and I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!